E3G and very happy to welcome you all to our event today. We're organising this together with WWF and with the support of the US mission to the EU. So this event is pretty exciting. It's taking place as part of a transatlantic climate roadshow that we're running this week. We're running it in 3 cities, Brussels, Berlin and Riga. And Brussels is the first stop today. And the reason why we're holding a transatlantic dialogue on climate change is because at E3G we think climate risk is a really important subject. It's really something that we're working on a lot, and we think it's so important to understand the risks of climate change to the EU, in the US, globally, to understand what it means for us as citizens in cities and communities, but across all areas of the economy. So we've brought over lots of great US experts who've come over to really talk about what's happening in the US. There's been a really rapid shift in climate politics in the US, and there's lots of things happening on the ground across all areas in the US on climate risk, on climate resilience, on climate security. So we thought we'd bring over our experts here who are kind of going to give a flavour of what's happening, and then we can have a sort of discussion afterwards on what that might mean for Europe. So just to kind of tell you how we're going to run our session today, we've got a panel discussion just now, and that will run until about 1 o'clock. We'll break for lunch. Lunch is all set up and looking delicious at the back. Once you've had got your lunch, please sit back down at your table, and we'll probably, as you're eating, we'll kickstart an exciting interactive session for the second part, thinking about what climate risks mean for Europe, and that will be led by Jason from WWF. So I think we've got a really exciting discussion lined up, and I'm going to pass over to Nick, who will lead the panel.
Hi there. Thank you, Rosie. I'm Nick Mabey. I'm the CEO of E3G, and I'd really like to thank the US Embassy mission here and WWF for their help in putting on this event and the roadshow. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the panel, and then we'll let them go. And then Reinhard Bütikofer is going to give some reflections at the end of the panel, though he's not up here right now. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So hopefully we will have around half and half talking heads and questions and answers for you. So just to start off, for those who don't know E3G that well, we're a non-profit. We work across Europe, London, Berlin and Brussels, but also we work in the US and China and Latin America. We've always had a strong focus on climate risk. Around 5-6 years ago, we brought a whole set of US security officials around Europe to talk about US work on climate security, and this is a natural next step. We found that a very productive process. What we're trying to do in the roadshow as a whole is not just introduce American experts and American thinking to Europe, but also to stimulate a European conversation about what this means for Europe and what are some of the things we need to do in Europe to address climate risk, address climate security, manage the transition to a low-carbon economy, and hopefully identify not just things we do as Europeans, but potentially areas of cooperation with the US or with other partners which can be strengthened to manage this problem. Because again, sometimes climate change is too much seen through the lens of some of the formal carbon control instruments and not as a more holistic area. So very much focusing on what is happening rather than hypotheticals, and very much focusing on what needs to be done going forward. I just want to give 3 words to frame the discussion, how we want to happen before we start. The first is risk, the second is responsibility, and the third is reform. The first, we want to have a discussion on risk because climate change affects everything we do, not just the risks of climate impacts, but also how responses to climate change affect both our energy policies, the risks around energy security, positive and negative, but also relationships, whether that's with China on trade and other areas. And we need to make some big choices about how we manage that. Are we going to have an orderly transition to a zero carbon economy, which is driven by cooperation and by managing as well as we can to anticipate how things change, or a disorderly transition where we're caught out by events and by crises? Because in the end, we have to get to the same place, but one is more manageable than the other. And I think that issue of an orderly versus disorderly transition and thinking about how we positively manage this process is really important, because that goes beyond looking at the issues of carbon or even the narrow focus on adaptation to a much more broad societal task. But then that brings me to the second word, responsibility. Who is responsible for managing these risks? Who's responsible for actually engaging? And we've done a lot of work in Europe and globally on this. And the answer is, well, it's often very unclear. It's actually quite unclear at the top of governments who's responsible for managing climate change as an overall policy area. In the UK, it was meant to be the National Security Council. They had a formally responsibility. It's chaired by the Prime Minister, looking at both internal and external risk and our mitigation posture. However, it's never discussed it in around 2 or 3 years. It's never really gripped the issue. It's usually unclear who's responsible for looking at the external impacts of climate change on supply chains or migration or security. And even at the city level, if you look at who's responsible or who's meant to respond to climate change at city level or at citizen level, they often, the powers they have to respond don't match the responsibilities they're given. And I recommend a small research study which Rosie led, looking at European cities when we looked at the how their responsibilities are. The title, Underfunded, Underprepared, Underwater, Cities at Risk, might give you a hint as to our conclusion. But then it's not surprising that our systems aren't fit for purpose for a risk we didn't anticipate. We built all of our infrastructure and policies based on the concept that climate was static and it moved between various places. So as that's changed, it's not surprising we need the third R, which is reform. So it's not just about saying we need to tell people what the risks are and the systems we have will naturally respond. If we want to respond to the concept of the carbon bubble and stranded assets, we need to change how we regulate finance. China is looking intensively at how China does that in financial reform terms. The EU is not through the Capital Markets Union. We have, I think, gripped the idea of how do we manage the energy system going to a zero carbon future through the energy union. We've got to see that play out. But I think Europe is looking at structural reform, as some member states like Germany and the UK already have, moving forward, and France. But I think we haven't begun to look at the reforms we need to make in our international cooperation or in our domestic resilience to manage the type of linked cascading disasters which the US has seen in Superstorm Sandy and in Katrina, and perhaps because the EU is intrinsically less exposed to some of these extremes than the US, we can learn a lot from what they've done. So that's the introduction. That's what I wanted to get into your head before you started listening to the speakers, to think of where are those places where we need to reform how we do things to make sure that our systems match the world we're going to live in. No matter what we do, no matter how much we mitigate, we are still going to have to respond to uncertain levels of climate risk, as well as managing a transition to a zero fossil fuel economy. It's very unlikely we can't do that with business as usual approaches. Okay, so just to go through the speakers and introduce them before we start. The first, we'll go in order. So Alden Meyer, who's scribbling down obviously his notes for what he's going to say, who's Director of Strategy and Policy at the Union of Concerned Scientists, a long-term observer of US climate politics, but also Union of Concerned Scientists done some of the most interesting work on climate risk and community engagement across the US. Then Vicky Arroyo, who's the Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center. Again, someone really in the understanding the depth of how the US responding to the mitigation challenge and also the issues of climate risk, both at the national level but also at the state level, and understanding how these issues are really being baked into American politics. Perhaps we've focused too much on the Congress and not enough on some of these lower level areas. Then go to Christine Hoffmore, who's Director of Climate and Food Security at the Center for American Progress, just escaped from the US government, from the Pentagon, and is now going to speak for herself rather than the US government, and is a real expert on how the US government is trying to incorporate these risks into its national security policies, operations, and relationships. So again, the reality of how you go from scientific projections to real action on the ground. And finally, David Reig, an old colleague of mine from WWF, who's recently led and edited a book on American foreign policy and resource scarcity and climate change to give understanding of some of the broad challenges which are facing all of us. So that's the panel. As I said, Reinhard will give a response from the European side. But first, Alden.